Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. So this video is about Burns Night, which has just been. It was the 25th of January, so a month after Christmas. What is Burns Night? No, it's not about burning things. It's about Robert Burns, who is world-renowned as the national poet of Scotland. So he's a late 18th century poet. And 25th of January is his natal day. So we're celebrating Robert Burns' birthday, Rabbie Burns, as they often call him, because Scots slang for Robert is Rabbie. In Scots dialect, they often change the vowel, as in the O of Robbie becomes an A, Rabbie, like that. So he was born in Ayrshire, a county in south west Scotland, and into a farming family without much money. He only had a primary education. And he's notable for being a man of the people, because most of the celebrated poets of the English language around that time had been to some of the most illustrious schools in the United Kingdom and been to either Oxford or Cambridge. And I don't know if he ever even visited England, actually. So he's writing somewhat in English, somewhat in Scots dialect, which is Scotland's dialect. People often say now Scotland's language, which is closely related to English. So as I say, they often change the vowel. There's some sui generis words, and then it's hotly contested. Is it a language? Is it a dialect? Now, I spent 6 years in Scotland, and if someone's speaking Scots dialect, I couldn't always understand them, even after that. Maybe using non-canonical grammar, things like that. And of course, in England, people speaking their regional accents back in those days, it was much more distinctive back then, before an era of mass communication or mass transit, before the BBC and so on. Accents were not quite so standardized. People's local patois was very different in different parts of the country. So a lot of his works are not original. He collected these folk poesy, songs, rhymes and so forth, and polished them up. He changed them a bit, and then he published them, although some of his work is entirely original. And so he was farming for a while. He was fond of a wee dram, as in whiskey, and he travelled around southern Scotland a lot. There's a pub in Edinburgh still going there in the Grassmarket that he was known to frequent. But he had no patron, because in those days affluent aristocrats would often be a patron of the arts, and this person would financially support a poet or a painter or someone like that, and the artist would have to sing for his supper. So producing works of art to honour his or her patron in return for that stipend. So he might keep a salon for such artists. But Robert Burns wasn't having any of that. As I say, he was a man of the people and was just producing it for his own gratification and to provide aesthetic pleasure to the masses. So he considered emigrating to the West Indies. He didn't do that in the end. He's not a very political person, but his views did tend towards radical. He composed an ode to George Washington. That's not his actual title. I forget the real title of it. And he briefly worked as an excise officer, which might horrify some of his admirers, as in taxing things, because there was a tax on whiskey. 18th century, there's scarcely any income tax. Income tax was a temporary wartime measure to pay for things. The idea is that eventually we got rid of. In the 19th century, they kept trying to reduce it and abolish it, and never quite managed it. Obviously, it's here to stay now. But taxing goods, particularly whiskey, was the main thing that the government did to raise revenue, especially in Scotland. So people often had their private whiskey stills, secret whiskey stills, so he's having to find those and tax them. Because obviously he was a literate person. And remember, in the 18th century, a lot of people in the British Isles didn't get to go to school at all. So obviously he was a highly literate person, so had no difficulty doing the paperwork. I'm just trying to think of some of his most famous poems. There's a fairly long narrative one called Tam O'Shanter, about a ghost, and there's a Tam O'Shanter hat, which I suppose it takes its name from that poem. Or there's Scots were hey wi Wallace bled, about the Battle of Bannockburn. Robert the Bruce addressing his men on, I think it's Midsummer's Day, 1314, prior to that battle. So Scots who have with Wallace bled. That's what it would be in standard English. And Auld Lang Syne, which is long old since, or Old Long Since in standard English, Auld Lang Syne, that very famous poem which is often sung at New Year's parties. And then there's this one, I don't know the whole of it, but just it begins, fair for your honest sonsy face, great chieftain o' the Podden race, about haggis, addressed to a haggis, it's entitled. So how do people celebrate his birthday? They have haggis put on a big wooden tray. What is haggis? Well, people in Scotland often like to pull the leg of a tourist by telling the tourist that there's this curious animal that's born on a hillside. It's got one leg longer than the other. Well, it's got four legs, obviously, but two long, two short, like that, depending which side of the hill it's born. Okay, therefore, it can run around the hill, but only one direction, because two sets of legs, with legs on one side are longer than the other. But no, a haggis is made from sheep's stomach and guts like that. So it's often as poor man's food because it wasn't the expensive cut of the meat, thought not so tasty. There's a bit of spice put with it. It's often served with mashed potato and neeps. Neeps meaning turnips. I know elsewhere in Romania, for example, turnips are fed to pigs. They're staggered that people would eat such things. But there we are. And they'd be drinking whiskey with it as well. So people would wear their folk dress, wear kilts usually. I'm not Scots, so I've never worn a kilt in my life. And the haggis as carried on would be piped in, as in a bagpipe or playing a tune that's brought in. Somebody would recite that poem addressed to a haggis by Robert Burns. Apparently this dish was not closely associated with Scotland at the time. It was really a Greek thing, so I've heard, and it's only become associated with Caledonia since the time of Robert Burns, since he died in 1797, if memory doesn't play me false. So Burns Night is celebrated by North British expatriate communities scattered all across the globe. And that's that. What else can I tell you about Robert Burns? Yeah, so he's honoured by statues in Australia, in London, obviously plenty in Scotland, that memorialise him. So a very splendid poet. I quite enjoy his works. And I don't think he ever wrote anything in prose, actually. Is there anything else I've pointed about him? Well, yeah, there's some bawdy ballads he wrote. So he was seems to be a bit of a libertine, certainly an Epicurean who lived life to the full, died at the age of only 37. And he penned a lot of love poems as well. So he's buried in his birthplace, Alloway, if I've got that right. So that's him. Robert Burns. Find out more about him, read his works. I think you'll find it deeply satisfying.